I was born in Korea in 1960. What I know is very little, and I suppose it's typical for many Korean adoptees. Um, my brother and I were adopted in 1961 at the age of 8 months old by European American parents brought to Milwaukee, where we were raised in Wisconsin. What our adoptive parents were told was that we were in an orphanage in Seoul. Our adoptive parents adopted us through a Norwegian missionary, not through an adoption agency. Our parents were told that our birth parents died before we were born, that our birth mother died in childbirth, and that our birth father had died before our birth, which is called a posthumous birth, when the father is dead before the mother gives birth. Now, many adoptees, of course, are told stories that are not true. And when I was younger, I never really doubted the story that our adoptive parents told me and my brother. When I became more and more familiar with the Korean adoptee community, met other adoptees, heard a lot of stories, heard a lot of personal stories about how the stories that they were told turned out not to be true, that adoption agencies or other parties misled adoptees or their parents about the circumstances of their birth and adoption, then I began to wonder whether or not the story that our adoptive parents were told was true. I have no reason to believe that it was not. And in fact, some circumstantial reasons to believe that it was true. First, while I wasn't part of the very first wave of Korean adoptees, I was maybe the second wave. Obviously, the first wave started in the wake of the ending of the Korean War in 1953. Adopting Korean infants was still a very unusual thing in 1960, 1961. So in fact, the Milwaukee Sentinel, which was the morning newspaper, did a story on our adoption. That's how unusual it was. Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world at the time of my birth and adoption. So the idea that a woman giving birth to not only one child but two might die in childbirth is not at all far-fetched. Both infant mortality and maternal mortality in Korea in 1960-61 were very high. It was Korea had one of the highest rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality. So it's not only plausible but extremely credible, the idea that our birth mother would die giving birth to us. I always wondered about my birth father's death. When I was in graduate school, this was in 1994, I picked up a history of Korea. I'd read some Korean history before that, but I was forcibly struck by a passage in this book that referred to the uprising against Syngman Rhee, the dictator, president for life, who ruled Korea at that point with an iron fist, in April 1960, which would have been about the time that my brother and I were in utero. Now, thousands of people, including students, workers, and others, were killed in that revolution. And so I wondered whether or not my birth father was one of them. I think it's a rather romantic notion to think that I was born to make revolution, but that's the way I like to think of it. I do have the name of the Lutheran missionary who apparently was instrumental in our adoption. And I actually found one newspaper article about him recently. His name was Kurt Voss, V-O-S-S. He was a Norwegian Lutheran missionary. Other than that, and I doubt that he'd be alive now because that was, 52 years ago, and it's unlikely that he'd still be around. The only other thing that I've done was last year I decided to do DNA testing. And in fact, I have found 4 cousins who are related to me genetically, supposedly. One of them is in Florida, one is in Denmark, one is in Canada, but 2 of them are here in New York. And I met one of them who lives in Brooklyn in November, and I'm going to meet the other one who lives in Manhattan next week. And it's really exciting to discover birth family because until November, when I met this cousin Michael, my twin brother was the only birth family that I've ever known. So my brother and I were adopted by European American parents, and we grew up on the south side of Milwaukee, which at the time we grew up was all white, mostly Catholic, German and Polish. We were the only non-white children in our elementary school. Our junior high and high school were a little bit more diverse, but not much. There were a few other Asians in our junior high and high school. They were mostly other Korean adoptees, interestingly enough. Our parents were at least a half generation older than us. They adopted when they were older than a lot of parents. Our mother had a hysterectomy, which is why she couldn't have children of her own, and so they decided to adopt. Our mother was 3rd and 4th generation German American. Our father was 2nd generation Norwegian American. And one of the things, I guess, growing up that I never had was any sense of what I would look like when I grew up. Because obviously I knew that I probably wouldn't look like my tall, blonde-haired but balding Norwegian-American father, or my stout German-American Hausfrau mother. But we didn't really have any other adult Asians around us other than the the owner of a Chinese restaurant downtown, who was our mother's boss at one point, and she would take us at least once a year to this Chinese restaurant where she was a waitress many years before, called Toy's Chinatown Restaurant. And her boss was Moy Toy, and then his son, and they doted on us when we came in, and they gave us little toys and gifts. But other than him, we really didn't have any adult Asians around us, or any sense of what I would look like growing up. Our parents were extremely devout Lutherans, and so we went to church every Sunday, and we grew up very much as part of this extended church family as well as our mother's family. And so our childhood was pretty heavily influenced by this church ambiance. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was taken over by its fundamentalist wing about the time of our confirmation in 1973, and it's the most conservative of the synods, the subdenominations of the Lutheran Church. Our experience was also very much influenced by the fact that my brother and I were twins, which of course is an unusual thing. So we were both the only Asians in our elementary school, the only pair of twins that I can remember, and extremely bookish. So from the very beginning, I was really different in all sorts of ways. We had a very, I think, cozy and warm and loving family in many ways. And it was a relatively happy childhood, I think, until our father died when we were 12, turning 13. And that really posed a lot of challenges. It plunged our family into poverty in many ways. And so there was that whole set of issues. Our parents were did not have a lot of formal education. My father went to high school. My mother actually didn't finish high school because when she was 16, she suffered a bout of nephritis and lost one kidney. And so neither of them had much formal education. My father loved to read, and my brother and I certainly picked up on that habit from a very young age. Our parents encouraged us to be proud of our Korean heritage, but really didn't have much background to help us out with that. So we were pretty much left to our own devices in terms of figuring out what that heritage might be. I read whatever I could get my hands on in terms of Korea, but that wasn't a whole lot. I think I would have most definitely taken Korean if it had been available to us, but it wasn't until college that I had any such opportunity. And I actually have never formally studied Korean. The last few years I've been trying to learn Hangul, but other than that, and knowing sort of restaurant Korean, knowing the difference between japchae and bulgogi, I can't say I know a lot of Korean. I think that the circumstances of my growing up strongly influenced my sense of identity or lack of identity. If my brother and I had been white, even if we'd been adopted, I think we would have fit in to our neighborhood, our school, even our adoptive family in a very different way. My sense of being different was heightened, exacerbated by the fact that we were treated as being different by a lot of people, including other kids at school. There was a certain amount of bullying and harassment, which a lot of Korean adoptees have experienced. It wasn't intense, but it was certainly enough to give me a certain sense of alienation from any notion of being American, since I was told in subtle and not so subtle ways on many occasions that I was viewed as being less than American. One thing that stands out was that every Pearl Harbor Day, someone would make some sort of comment. Occasionally that escalated into strange incidents like kids throwing firecrackers at me and my brother, or little stink bombs, things like that, from passing buses, or chanting strange, silly slogans. Of course, it's rather absurd to blame Korean adoptees for the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. We had, generally speaking, a very typical upbringing for our time period, 1960s, 1970s. As I say, my parents were extremely religious, extremely devout. But other than our being Asian and being Korean adoptees, our upbringing was not substantially different from anyone else in our neighborhood or in our school. Well, so the rough outline of my personal history really has to do with particular locations. I tend to think of periods of my life as related to living in different cities. Having grown up in Milwaukee and spent all but the first 8 months of my childhood there, then moving to Madison, where my brother and I went to the University of Wisconsin as undergraduates in 1978 to 81. Then I moved to London, 81 to 83, where I did a year abroad, my first year, and then the second year I did a master's degree at the London School of Economics. I moved back to the US in October 83, moved in with my brother in Chicago, and lived there until 1988. I spent 4 years in my first career, which was in public relations. I worked for 4 different organizations in Chicago, 2 of which were public relations firms. I eventually decided that public relations, while it had been an interesting career, was not really a fulfilling one, and decided to go back for my PhD in political science, and was at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign from 1988 to 1994. In the midst of that time period, I spent 2 months in Berlin in 1990 at the time of formal reunification, which was very interesting and quite fascinating. I was in that huge crowd of 3 million people in the Tiergarten in October 1990 when the federal president and the chancellor rang in formal reunification, striding through the Brandenburg Gate as the chimes were rung at midnight on October 3rd. I spent a year in Europe in 1991-92 doing my dissertation research. I spent the summer in this Bavarian city called Regensburg, where I lived for 6 weeks in a 12th century medieval tower called Goldener Turm, the Golden Tower. I moved to Brussels in August, and I spent the fall in Brussels, and then in the spring of 1992, I spent 6 months in Paris, and that was a really fascinating experience. So I've lived in 5 different European cities: London, Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and Regensburg. I went back to Champaign-Urbana, which of course was a bit of a letdown after Paris, and finished my PhD, moved back to Chicago in 1994. I taught at a small liberal arts college from 94 to 95, moved to New York, where I taught for 2 years from 95 until through 96, and then went through a major life transition. That included my gender transition, which is a significant enough event in and of itself, transitioning and coming out as transgendered, but also went through a professional transition as well, getting into activism and advocacy work in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, and have been doing LGBT activism, advocacy work, and community organizing ever since then. I've lived in Jackson Heights, which is the most diverse neighborhood in Queens, since January 1997, so for 17 years now, and am currently the acting executive director of Queens Pride House, which is the LGBT community center in the borough of Queens. I've been involved with a number of different groups and organizations over the years, but Queens Pride House and Niagara, the New York Association for Gender Rights Advocacy, which I co-founded in 1998, are the 2 organizations that I've done the most work with, and the 2 that I've been most associated with. I guess I was probably born to have an identity complex, being both a Korean adoptee and being transgendered and thinking through all these various identity issues. I feel like I've worked through those issues and have a really good sense of who I am. But of course, it wasn't always that easy. Um, I have a really complex relationship to Korea because, of course, it's the land of my birth. In some senses, it's imprinted on my face. It's certainly imprinted in my DNA. Um, and yet, of course, I grew up in this European American family on the south side of Milwaukee in an all-white neighborhood. And so I didn't grow up with Korean culture, Korean language, Korean food. The first time I ever tried Korean food was when my mother took my brother and me to the first Korean restaurant that opened in Milwaukee. It was called the Blue Tower. And we went there. This was, I think, in our senior year in high school, so we would have been maybe 17 by that point, and tried Korean food for the first time. And it was actually a nice gesture, I think, on our mother's part. And of course, when I first tried Korean food, I thought, oh, this is really weird, because I'd never had it before, and it's very unusual for someone growing up on a meat and potatoes diet in Wisconsin. And since then, I've developed a taste for some kinds of Korean food, not all. I've developed a taste for bulgogi, even though I rarely eat beef, but I love bulgogi. And pajeon, which is this scallion pancake. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was in Champaign-Urbana as a grad student, there was a Korean-owned store, and I went in, kind of discovered it by chance, and decided that I would buy a big jar of kimchi. And I vowed that I would, by the time I got to the bottom of the jar, that I would love kimchi. Well, I never made it to the bottom of the jar, and I still don't particularly like kimchi. But I realized, thinking this whole thing through, that I didn't need to love kimchi in order to identify as a Korean American. I think growing up, I had in my mind this binary opposition between real Korean and fake Korean. Real Korean meaning grew up in Korea, or at least grew up with a Korean American family here in the US. Fake Korean meaning Korean adoptee who doesn't speak Korean and has actually not been back since being born there and adopted. And interestingly enough, I also had a similar evolution of thinking, struggling to come to terms with my identity as a transgendered woman. Once again, struggling with this binary opposition of real woman, fake woman, in terms of being male-bodied and yet identifying with femininity and gender identity that I was not assigned to at birth. And I think partly reading Michel Foucault at the end of my time in grad school helped significantly. It helped me deconstruct notions of authenticity and these various identity constructs and identity formations, and realize that they were in fact false dichotomies. The binary opposition between real and fake Korean, for example, recognizing and deconstructing this false dichotomy and realizing at the end of it that I in fact did have a real identity, which was as a Korean adoptee. And that my experience, while different from that of Koreans growing up in Korea or Korean Americans growing up with Korean American families, was still a distinct identity and a distinct experience. And connecting with the Korean adoptee community, which I did when I came here to New York, and attending the first international gathering of the first generation of Korean adoptees in Washington, D.C. in September 1999. I'd actually joined, also known as, which was the Korean Adoptee Organization here in New York, before that time, but I'd never been in a room full of Korean adoptees at a conference with over 2,000 Korean adoptees. And that was, I think, a mind-blowing experience for me as well as for a lot of other people at that conference. And staying in touch with a number of people from the gathering since then, and of course developing more friendships with other Korean adoptees, and recognizing that my identity as a Korean adoptee is no less authentic and no less real than the identities of Koreans and Korean Americans, and also understanding that having grown up in a European American household does not in and of itself make me white, but also acknowledging that there's nothing to be embarrassed about the fact that I grew up in a European American household in a white neighborhood. That's as much a part of my experience as my being transgendered and coming to terms with LGBT queer identity. And conversely, talking about my gender identity, recognizing that while I am male-bodied, that I have an identity as an openly transgendered woman that's no less valid and authentic as that of women who were assigned to the female sex at birth. And recognizing that there's an authenticity in terms of that experience as a transgendered woman. So, to some extent, I feel that even though, in some sense, these are multiple oppressions, to use the language of contemporary identity politics, that there's a positive dynamic that one can engage in when looking at these identity formations intersectionally. So that there was a kind of an iterative process between figuring out my identity as a Korean adoptee and figuring out my identity as an openly transgendered woman. Understanding that in both cases I was struggling with a binary opposition which was really a false dichotomy, which presented two very different choices in each case, neither of which resonated with my own experience, and neither of which fully reflected my own sense of self. So, in many ways, my childhood, my adolescence, my 20s, into my 30s were a long period of examination and exploration, experimentation, which ultimately produced the identity or identities that I now claim that really represent who I am and reflect an inner sense of who I am in terms of gender identity, in terms of race and ethnicity. Some of this, of course, has to do with a thinking through of my own individual identity. But I also think that there's a political element to this, in the best sense of that term, in that it's also made me question these larger structures, structures of race and ethnicity, nationality, gender identity, sexuality, class even, that have made me who I am. And thinking through the larger structures of oppression in the society that often serve as impediments for people from marginalized groups. Now, of course, every Korean adoptee, just like every LGBT person, has to work out for themselves exactly what their identity is, who they feel themselves to be. And that process and the outcome may be different in every case, because each of us is unique as an individual. But I do think that there are larger structural and political questions at play here in terms of Korean adoptee experience as well as LGBT experience. Several years ago, I was invited to present a conference paper at the biennial adoption conference at St. John's University here in Manhattan. And when I did so, it was the first time that I'd written extensively about intercountry adoption, not so much from an autobiographical point of view, but more from an analytical point of view. This was in October 2006, and I believe it's the first conference paper presented on LGBT issues in intercountry adoption at any conference. It's certainly the first one that I'm aware of. And in the paper, I addressed some of the issues that I thought were important because when I did the research on this paper, I realized that there were three different literatures here that were relevant, but that didn't really intersect. There was a substantial literature on intercountry adoption, but one that never really discussed LGBT issues. There was a substantial literature on LGBT issues in adoption, but it focused almost exclusively on domestic adoption and didn't talk about intercountry adoption, and didn't really substantially talk about transracial adoption issues. And then there was a third literature which was on transracial adoption, but was primarily couched in terms of black-white binary, talking primarily about African American children who are adopted by white families, not talking about Asian or intercountry adoptees, and not dealing with LGBT issues. So that conference paper, which I hope to rework and include in a book at some point, was my first attempt to address these issues intersectionally, looking at the intersection of LGBT community issues, intercountry adoption issues, and transracial adoption issues. Because, of course, not all intercountry adoptions are transracial, just like most transracial adoptions are actually not intercountry. And I think that to the extent that I am involved with the Korean adoptee community and the intercountry adoptee community, because of my background and experience, which is quite different from that of many other adoptees, I can bring a perspective that's a little bit unusual to a discussion of these issues. And I think when we discuss these issues, it's really important to distinguish between individual level issues and societal level issues. I think the issue of identity formation is in fact both. It is obviously an individual issue for the individual adoptee, trying to figure out who he or she is in terms of race, ethnicity, nationality. But it's also a societal level issue in that there are different players here, and of the various actors, adoptive parents have by far the most power in adoptee communities. Adoption agencies would be a close second, and the adoptees themselves often have very little power and very little voice, at least until they become adults. But as children, certainly if they're adopted as infants or very young children, they have no say in who adopts them or why. I've thought a great deal about the whole issue of intercountry adoption in terms of critiques of that institution. And I think many of them are valid, but I also don't think that those who label all intercountry adoption as abduction are doing a service to the adoptee community. I certainly did not feel that way. While it's true, on the one hand, I didn't have a choice of who adopted me or where I grew up, on the other hand, my parents adopted me and my brother, as far as we know, from an orphanage when we were orphans. And one of the things that I think that I reflect upon is how to view my adoption both in personal and political terms. So on the one hand, I don't feel, quote unquote, grateful to my parents for adopting me because they got something out of the bargain, which was 2 children, which they wanted. And I also think that that kind of gratitude can feed into a kind of a rescue narrative, which can be problematic, particularly since it's mostly white adoptive parents and mostly children of color involved with intercountry adoption. On the other hand, to label all adoption as abduction, I think, is false and damaging and does a real disservice to the adoptee community. First of all, because it doesn't distinguish between, and in fact trivializes actual abduction. There is a lot of fraud that is perpetrated, in some cases by adoption agencies, in others by middlemen and people who actually are involved in kidnapping babies and selling them. There's a lot of human trafficking going on, unfortunately, which the adoption industry has not fully addressed. And I think the adoption industry is, in fact, an industry, largely a for-profit industry. And most adoption agencies seem intent on sweeping a lot of this under the rug and engaging in happy talk and talking about happy children who are happy to be adopted by happy parents. Of course, not all adopted children are happy or have happy experiences. Some experience abuse at the hands of their adopted parents. Some face what I guess could only be called discrimination at the hands of adoptive parents who treat them differently and less well than birth children in the same family. That being said, when I think about the circumstances of my birth and adoption, just assuming for the sake of argument that the story that my adoptive parents were told was correct, that my brother and I were in fact orphans, then the likelihood that we would have died in infancy or early childhood was quite high. And in fact, our adoptive parents were told by doctors who examined us when we arrived that we probably would have died within a year or two because we were extremely malnourished. We each weighed about 6 pounds, and at the age of 8 months, that's very small, even for Asian children. And the other thing that my adoptive mother told me, I remember her telling us that the orphanage was pocketing the money that our adoptive parents were sending them for our care. There was a lot of corruption in Korea at the time, so that's probably not surprising. Our adoptive parents sent the people who were running the orphanage, extra money for our care, and they were just pocketing it. And so we were extremely malnourished when we came over. So in light of that, assuming that that account was true, and I have no reason to believe it's not, then our adoption did, in fact, probably save our lives. As I say, I want to be careful not to fall into a rescue narrative or a gratitude narrative, but I also want to recognize what are the probable facts of my adoption, and also acknowledge that even if I had survived infancy and childhood, I wouldn't have had much of a future in Korea. Industrialization under Park Chung-hee proceeded apace in the 1960s, but it wasn't until the 1980s that Korea really started to take off. And of course now South Korea is the 11th largest economy in the world. It's extremely high tech, has a vibrant economy, but that was not true in the 1960s and 1970s. It was still an extremely poor country, still shattered by the war, both World War II and then the Korean War. And so there were very few opportunities for anyone, let alone orphans. Anyone who knows anything about Korea knows that bloodlines are everything, and those without family are really nothing and nobody. Maybe that's just starting to change, but it's still very true that you are known by your family connections. And so orphans growing up in Korea are really pretty much largely excluded from society. They exist on the margins of society. Maybe if you're lucky, you might be able to get a job as a garbage collector or something like that. Factory worker, maybe. But the opportunities that I had, even growing up in a lower middle class family on the south side of Milwaukee, were still considerably more than any opportunities I would have had growing up in an orphanage in Seoul in the 1960s. And as I say, I want to be very careful not to be misunderstood, not to be I'm not engaging in a gratitude or rescue narrative, but I also understand the circumstances of my birth and adoption and my childhood. And as someone who now identifies as openly transgendered, I also recognize that the opportunities for anyone who was LGBT queer in Korea in the 1960s and 70s would have been nil. Even today, it's extremely difficult for anyone who's openly gay, let alone transgendered, to get a job of any kind. Most transgendered women still work in the sex industry or bar girls at best. And while things have changed considerably in the last 10 years or so, with Harisu, who's a very popular transgendered singer, a few gay actors coming out, King and the Clown, which was a huge box office hit as a film, still Korea remains a relatively patriarchal, homophobic, and transgender-phobic society. And of course, we face many challenges here in the United States, but when I talk to Korean activists from Korea, which I do on a fairly regular basis, they still feel that Korea has a very long ways to go. And so not only being an orphan in Korea, but being LGBT queer in some sense, gay and or transgendered, I would have had really rather enormous challenges. And so looking back on all of this and looking at it as objectively as one can about one's own life, I think that it was fortunate for me to have been adopted. Notwithstanding all the challenges, the identity complexes, even some of the the bullying and the harassment. Having said all that, I have opportunities that I never would have had in Korea, even though I regret not having grown up speaking Korean. I grew up speaking English, which has become the global language of business, of culture, of politics and diplomacy. And so I think that in the end, when I look back on it as objectively as I can, for all the challenges of having grown up a Korean adoptee here in this country, I wouldn't have had it any other way. Those experiences are what made me who I am today. And I think also that from a more spiritual perspective, everything happens for a particular reason. I sometimes think that I was meant to have my parents as adoptive parents. I find it interesting that some people use the term real parents to apply to their birth parents. It's extremely unlikely that my birth parents are still alive, and even if they were, it would be very difficult to find them. And I recognize and honor them as my birth parents, and recognize my Korean ancestors as my Korean ancestors. And yet, if I use the phrase real parents, it can only apply to my adoptive parents because they're the only parents I ever knew. Every adoptee has to figure out for themselves what their relationship is to their adoptive parents and to birth parents if they do a birth search. But for me, that relationship is fairly clear, which is that my adoptive parents were my real parents. And as I say, I sometimes think that I was really fated to have them as my parents, and perhaps they were fated to have me and my brother as their children. It's funny, having done this DNA testing last year, meeting birth relatives for the first time, other than my twin brother, and thinking about all that as well. I think that it shows both the promise and the limitations of those kinds of technologies. On the one hand, I am really excited to be meeting birth relatives and to discover that I have quite a lot in common with them, because actually all of the birth cousins that I've found who are listed as being third, fourth, fifth, or beyond cousins are Korean adoptees. So we have a huge amount in common in terms of Korean adoptee experience. On the other hand, of course, one grows up with those who one grows up with. And I've been shaped by my experiences, the good and the bad, from birth onwards. And of course, the choices that I've made since then. And so really, to that extent, I don't regret anything. How can I regret the circumstances either of my birth or my adoption? Because they're so much a part of who I am today.